Hello and Happy New Year 2021. Let's kick off the year and talk about some poetry. I recently read this collection of essays by Kathleen Raine, That Wondrous Pattern, Essays on Poetry and Poets. This collection was published in 2017, although the essays really span a large portion of the 20th century. Kathleen Raine lived between 1908 and 2003, and I decided to read this collection because she was mentioned in a book I read last year called The Secret Teachers of the Western World by Gary Lockman. I chatted that also, so I will link to the chat and the details below. But I didn't know a lot about her, so when I was looking her up, I came across this collection of essays, and I just decided to give this a read. And I thought to structure sort of what to chat about in this book chat. I thought I'd start out with just kind of going over what's in the table of contents, just to give you an idea of really how the book is structured as far as what kind of essays are in it. So there are 3 sections here. The first section is called The Presence of Poetry, and the essays in this section are what is the use of poetry as well as the writing of poems. And then section 2 is called The Wisdom of Poetry, and these essays are What is Man, Premises in Poetry, The Inner Journey of the Poet, On the Symbol, and the Use of the Beautiful. And then the third section is called The Witness of Poetry, and this section is mostly about poets like Shelley, Wordsworth, Yeats, Hopkins, Moore, Vernon Watkins. There's a lot in here. I thought I would just go over some of the essays and sort of my warm takes from them, not hot takes, because when I was reading this, I was thinking I wasn't getting a lot from this. Although I was making little notes and things like that, but I was thinking, this book is kind of over my head. But then as I went after I finished it and went to sort of think about it, I found that I got more from it than I had actually thought. So I think this is a good testament really to the benefit of spending a little time with a book after you've finished it, just sort of giving it a little bit of time to sit with you and then sort of give it some thought afterwards. But so let's just run through some of the essays and some of the warm takes that I took away from them. So from the essay called The Writing of Poems, this essay really talks about the materialist approach versus the spiritual approach. So it's talking about the state, like the poet's sort of relationship to the state. And the argument is made in this essay that, the materialist approach to the state is to think about rights, but the spiritual approach to the state is to think in terms of duties. And so she's arguing in this essay that the poet, should be more about the spiritual aspect, be more about duties. And there's a quote in this essay that says, "It is not the state who should support the poet, but the poet who should save the state." She's saying, civilization ultimately depends on the people who give more than they get from things. And so there's that discussion, but there's also a discussion in this essay about poets who make their living doing other things other than poetry, like Chaucer and Milton and Spenser. I thought that was really interesting. And then from Premises in Poetry, this essay talks about poetry being a different language, that it's a type of spiritual language or a soul language. There's a quote here that I thought was really cool from this essay. "When the reader's field of association, which alone gives meaning to words, is very different from that of the poet, he will not be reading through the words on the page the same poem as the poet wrote. He speaks a different language. Though the words he uses may be the same on the page, but they do not carry the same meaning." I think this is so interesting because I think that this really is also about books reading in general, where, when you read the book, it's different than what the poet or the author might have actually had in mind when they wrote it, because you're bringing your own experience to that. You have your own inner language, your own spiritual language, and it's that language that you're using to engage and connect with that work. So that was really cool. And then from the inner journey of the poet, this talks about beauty being cosmic, and how if you put an image before us, this beautiful image of beauty before us, how it really connects with sort of our inner world and sort of this cosmic thing, and how beauty and the beautiful is true to an archetype, and so that connecting with that harmonizes us. It gives us an inner harmony, not only with our inner harmony with ourselves, but with all others, because we share this with everybody. So we have this sort of inner harmony, this sort of inner connection to beauty in common. And, she argues in this essay that without these sort of works of beauty, that a society will suffer a sort of moral and spiritual sickness that she's arguing, that our society has today. This essay was actually written in 1976, but I think it's even more true perhaps today than it was then. But she argues in this essay that everything you do contributes to this harmony or is destructive to it. So this inner harmony of beauty that you have, so the music you listen to, the books you read, the movies and films you see and things like that, it's either sort of reinforcing that harmony or it's destructive to it. And she talks about in this essay about Plato's concept of memory as being this sort of cosmic memory and how we're sleeping most of the time, but then we come across something beautiful and it really sort of connects with us, and really for a moment we're really awakened, we're awakened to the cosmic. And this really reminded me too of Pentatonics videos that I've been watching recently, the a cappella group Pentatonics. I went through this rabbit hole, how I can do sometimes on YouTube, go down these various rabbit holes. And I was just watching a bunch of reaction videos to the song Hallelujah sung by the a cappella group Pentatonics. And I would say probably 7 or 8 out of 10 people, when they watch that video, listen to that song, they cry. And many of them will say in their reaction video, like, oh, I didn't expect to do that. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's connecting to that beauty. It's an example of that connection that we can get through poetry and music and other sorts of art. So I thought that was super, super cool. And then from the essay called The Use of the Beautiful, this asks the questions, what do we at the present time, what are we asking of poetry? What do we want it to do for us? Do we want it to raise our consciousness, expand our awareness of what it is to be human, connect us to beauty, harmony? What do we want from that? She rejects as meaningful much of what's published as poetry. This again was written in 1966, but I think this is definitely still true today. She rejects things that poetry, for example, that's published that mainly is just a description of something. Sometimes it's pleasing, sometimes it's just a description, or it may be even angry. But, she doesn't really consider that meaningful poetry as far as poetry goes. And then another thing that she rejects as poetry is really self-expression of the poet. Like, the poet, as far as writing something to be therapeutic, she really doesn't like that, where art is like therapy. Like, yeah, that might be therapy, but why would I, as the reader, want to read your therapy? Like, unless it's got something to say to me, the reader, then, she's arguing that, it's not really poetry, because poetry, in her view, is this transcendent thing. So I thought that was interesting. And then there's an essay called On the Symbol, and, I love symbols. I love practicing symbolic thinking. Like, I do this when I read in general. If I'm reading, a lot of times I'll read, as I'm reading a book, I'll just like look for symbols. Even though it's a work of science fiction or something that's not necessarily meaning for it to be a symbol, I will look for it because I love symbols. And I love symbolic sort of practicing, sort of thought experiments in symbolic thinking. So that was kind of an interesting essay for me. And then there's an essay called From Innocence and Experience, that in this essay, she talks about the view of the soul, that mechanistic view of the universe that, for example, the philosopher Locke had, versus that of the poet Blake. And in 1788, Blake had a quote here that he wrote in answer to Locke. He says, according to Mr. Locke, the soul is a mere tabula, a rasa tabula, an empty recipient, a mechanical blank. But then from this essay, Kathleen Raine says, for Blake, every child is a divine child, a manifestation of the imagination of God in the human world. The birth of Jesus Christ is reflected in every birth. The one God is reflected multitudinous in all the many births which bring the divine self into human existence. In every child there lives the indivisible universal spirit that knoweth all things. thought that was so pretty. So I thought that was cool. Then there's an essay about Yeats's holy city of Byzantium, this whole concept he had of the holy city of Byzantium, and Byzantium as the inner soul, like this holy soul, this holy city within, as well as saying something about reality in general, our connection to the divine in general. So that was real interesting, and I need to read more poetry by Yeats. And then there's from the essay called Edwin Moore, which is about the poet Edwin Moore. It talks about time, how time fades many poems. And he says this is the case. Raine says this is the case with a lot of poetry, but not that by Moore. She's arguing in this essay. She says time that so remorselessly fades some poems, which in their day seemed impressive, makes others at first little noticed to glow with some inner light. I think this can also be said about movies and books in general that, they don't all age well, right? And sometimes they aren't successes, or they don't really resonate with the time in which they first appear in print, but then later on, they do gain resonance. So I think that's super interesting, and I love that. I love to see that when that happens. And then also in this essay is talking about story and fable of a person's life. So the story is a person's individual life, which is a material thing, but the fable is that which life is seeking to become. So story and fable. Everybody's got a story, which is their individual life, but they've got a fable, what they want to be. So the story is the material thing, and the fable is the spiritual thing. And I think that is so cool and so beautiful. Then there's this really cool essay called Wordsworth, A Remembered Experience. There was a lot in this essay. There's a quote here that says, at the time of his writing, no doubt Wordsworth political enthusiasms found an echo which had more to do with history than with poetry. So he's talking about here how artists like Wordsworth, Milton, Chaucer, etc., how they were writing in one time, again, transcends the time of the future. She says, Milton too had strong political affiliations, but who cares now, as we read Lycidas or Il Penseroso, or indeed Paradise Lost? Or who cares whether Dante supported the Guelphs or the Ghibellines? I think that's so cool because, and here in the U.S., we just came out of a political season, and, at the long view is that politics and things like that all pass away, but poetry and art is sort of eternal, I think is what she's trying to say here. Then finally, before I run out of time, I just thought it would be cool to kind of close with this poem. It's from Wordsworth's Ode, Intimations of Immortality by Wordsworth. It says, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. I think that is just beautiful. How we are asleep, as humans. When we're born, we actually go to sleep. And our soul, though, we have a spiritual life. We have a connection to something bigger at our life's star. And, elsewhere, it comes from elsewhere and it goes elsewhere. It connects to elsewhere other than sort of the material. So I think that is just beautiful. So I am going to close the chat with that. My next chat is going to be, let me call it up here, God Emperor of Dune by Frank Herbert. This is book 4 of the Dune series by Frank Herbert that I've been reading my way through. I have already finished that, so I should have a chat on that coming up fairly soon. This book, I hope, I am actually sending this to my favorite poet, my favorite living poet. James is about to get this book. It's going to be in the mail this week, and I do hope that everyone finds some beauty to connect with every day in your life. So, Happy New Year again.